This is Behind the Verdict. I'm John Horford with Myron Cook. In today's episode, we want to dig a little bit more into the history of the people involved in this case. And we want to just get right to it. So, who were Aundria Bowman and Kathleen Doyle, and what happened to them?
Well, let's start with Kathleen Doyle. Her case came first in time. Kathleen was a young wife of a Navy pilot. She lived in Norfolk, Virginia, and unfortunately, she was murdered in her home and tortured, quite honestly. And I think it's a situation where the Norfolk Police Department at first didn't have a lot of leads. They didn't have a direction for their case to go. They investigated, they did everything they could, but they couldn't find anything for a very long time. And that was in 1980. Luckily, with scientific advancements in genealogy and DNA, those factors changed eventually. And we'll get to that in a minute about how they changed, but she was just a young wife trying to live her life while her husband was away on maneuvers, and she got killed. And then fast forward 9 years to 1989, March 11 of 1989, Aundria Bowman was a 14-year-old girl living in Michigan with her adopted parents and their biological child, who was pretty young. I want to say the sister was maybe 18 months, 2 years old. And Aundria had said that her adopted father, Dennis Bowman, had sexually assaulted her. She recanted that, and then ultimately she was murdered. One of the interesting factors about her case, though, is the murderer reported her missing, that she ran away, and also reported that she stole things from the home. So initially, Aundria was the one who was charged with larceny.
Yeah, which is just more deception, more lies, and obviously it's because of criminals trying to stay free, to continue to do whatever it is that they're trying to do. In this case, I mean, sexually assault women, murder people. You had mentioned with Kathleen that it was torturous. Why do you use that word?
Well, you're right about the deception. I mean, there was so much deception by this murderer in both of these cases. But in Kathleen's case, this person broke into her home, tortured her, strangled her, stabbed her, sexually assaulted her, burned her. And
do they know that she was alive when a lot of that happened?
We don't know for sure. For some of it, we do believe she was alive. We're not sure about all of it. And then ultimately, he killed her in her own home.
What happened in between these murders? You said 9 years. So what happened in between?
9 years went by, and I think this murderer thought he got away with what he did to Kathleen. And so he did other things to other people. There were other sexual assaults. There were other abuse type things that he did. We do believe that he had sexually assaulted Aundria long before she was murdered. And, once she came out and said what happened to her, she didn't have a lot of support. And so what we saw happen from that was she recanted. And I think that just gave this person more thought, more ability to keep doing what he was doing. He didn't get caught. We know that before he went to Virginia in 1980, he actually was charged with the attempted kidnapping and sexual assault of a young girl. And he was on bond for that when he went to Virginia for Naval Reserve training for 2 weeks in 1980. And that's when Kathleen was murdered.
How does he keep getting away with this? There's no one coming forward. There weren't signs. There weren't people in his life that were like, this is a little shady, or there was nothing to lead people to be like, okay, this guy, like, there's something going on here. Like, he's a threat to the community.
He's a serious threat to the community, and the difficulty is the person closest to him, his wife, claimed she never knew any of this was going on. So,
do you believe that?
I could never find evidence to the contrary, and I looked really hard.
I bet you did.
I wanted to make sure this wasn't something she knew and helped cover up, but we could never find any evidence to that.
Is that common in cases, just in general, because you have such an extensive history as a prosecutor? Is that common in cases for a spouse to not know how devious the person that they've, built this life with truly is?
Yeah, I think it happens a lot. I think sometimes there may be denial, like they don't want to believe that the person they love the most in the world is this horrible, heinous person.
Yeah.
So that's one side of it. But the other side is people like this, people like Dennis Bowman, this murderer, actually have the ability to be kind of two different people. He went to church, he taught Sunday school, he did all these really nice things that looked nice on the outside, but nobody really knew what he'd done so far and what he was planning to do.
Yeah.
And so I think that's hard. I think it's hard for families and friends to come forward and go, hey, I think this is kind of weird at the time. Now, hindsight for all of us is 2020. And
It's like red flag, red flag, red flag, red flag.
Exactly. And things get so much clearer later on when you can piece the whole puzzle together. But that's one of the analogies I use in trial is a puzzle. So if I show you one puzzle piece and it's just something blue, and you have no idea what that whole picture is going to be until all those pieces connect, right? And then it takes longer to do that. But once it connects, you can look back and go, oh, I should have saw that sign,
Yeah.
or I should have looked at this.
Yeah. Ugh. It's just, and we're dealing with people's lives here, and, time is of the essence. And I guess in certain cases, time would be of the essence. But in these types of situations, being able to gather evidence as quickly as possible, to piece it together as thoroughly as possible, to get a stronger case against an individual and put them away for a longer period of time to, protect society. I mean, how often is it that you just are unable? Like, are there people who are so good at committing these types of crimes that you just can't piece things together? You might know, like, this person is absolutely guilty. Like, something in my gut just tells me, it screams like they have committed these crimes. But when you can't prove it, or when you can't get a jury to believe beyond a reasonable doubt, what do you do in those types of situations?
Well, that's a really good point, because all of the investigators, all of the people in prosecution that worked on this case, on Aundria's side of the case, from the very beginning, really looked at Bowman, looked at this guy and said, hey, you know what, we think he's involved, but we had nothing to prove it. So our guts were there. And, the cold case teams of detectives, my office prior to me and including me, continued to look at that for years to see what's going on. But the biggest thing was he was deceptive. I mean, when he murdered Aundria, he put her body in the garage, covered her with a tarp, burned her bag of clothes and her jacket that he claimed she was running away with. And then he called the police and said that she was a runaway and she stole from the home, all the while knowing this young girl's dead in the garage.
How did you guys find out that was the case, though?
We didn't know that until fast forward 30 years when he finally confessed. But he only confessed because he'd been arrested on the Kathleen Doyle case.
Yeah. So had he not confessed, you never would have known that.
No, we wouldn't have known that
There's no way
piece.
to know that.
No.
Yeah.
And so when she's reported a runaway, that's deception. So people are looking for a runaway. And unfortunately, there were...
Who's committed larceny?
Yeah. Who has charges of her own pending against her for stealing money from him.
Yeah.
Which none of which was true.
Exactly.
Right? And so the difficulty was there were people who claimed, good-natured people from the community who thought they saw her at a roller skating rink, or that they saw her at a store or a gas station or at some other place. And all of those tips were, investigated. But the difficulty is at that point, you're like, okay, maybe she is a runaway and we just haven't caught up to her yet.
Can someone's criminal history be an accurate predictor of future actions?
I think it can sometimes. Sometimes I think someone does something wrong and they made a mistake and they can learn from it. They can maybe get some probation, get some help, get some treatment if it's like a drug thing or whatever, and they can change. So I would never sit here and say it is an absolute predictor. But when you have circumstances like the kind of cases Dennis Bowman committed, sexual assaults, repeated sexual assaults on young children, on adults, and then you have abuse that goes along with it, we can look at that now and certainly see a pattern. a pattern of this abuse, a pattern of this manipulation and control over women. And I think that, wow, if we could predict that earlier, you could save a lot. But it's really hard, again, to put that puzzle together when you don't have all the pieces.
I want to shift a little bit to the role that the early abuse in Aundria's life played. What were the early signs of dysfunction that you could identify in Aundria's life with the Bowmans?
Looking at the snapshot of her life, we were able to look through photo albums, and that was really, really illuminating. So the Bowmans adopted Aundria because they didn't think they could have a kiddo of their own. And in the early photos of those photo albums, Aundria is dressed really cute. Her hair is done perfectly. She's got cute little, a locket on or something else. And it seemed like photos were taken maybe every 3 months, right? Because you could see a very easy progression if you just flipped through them all at once. But right around the time she got into middle school is when they had a biological child of their own. And you could see things changed a little bit. Aundria wasn't smiling in the photos anymore. She looked kind of sad. She looked kind of down. And we believe that's when the sexual assaults were happening. We learned from a lot of things Bowman told us in some of his confessions that you don't do things like this to family. And so one of the things we thought is he no longer saw her as family.
So just having a biological child flipped that switch. So he, in his mind, she was his daughter until he could conceive a daughter that had his own DNA. And then he was like, okay, this is no longer my daughter. This is not family anymore.
That's my opinion from piecing it together. Because some of the other things he said later on is you don't kill family. And we know he killed her. So when you put it all together, it looks like that would be a plausible reason for why things changed with him. And it could be also she was easy access. She's in the home. She's older. She's developing as a young girl. And
he had the tendencies that he had, and he could just use this as a justification to abuse someone. Well, she's not really family. She's not blood related. Our other daughter, like that's family.
Actually, yeah, and she was somewhat quiet. Aundria was kind of a quiet girl. She wasn't necessarily always outspoken or anything else from what we learned from her friends back in the day. And so maybe he thought he picked the perfect victim, somebody in my home, somebody who's not going to speak out. And if she does, then you know what? I'm going to paint her as a liar.
Is it possible that the abuse had started when she was younger and not when the second child had come, and you guys just weren't aware of it or aren't aware of it? Is that possible?
Yeah, it's possible because we don't know. And, unfortunately, Aundria can't tell us herself when it started. So we just try to do the best we can.
Bowman never told you guys?
No. Well, he claimed he never sexually assaulted her.
Really?
Yeah, he was that deceptive.
He still says that.
He says, I never did that. But then in the next breath, he says, you don't kill family. So, how much of what he says can you really believe?
Exactly. Everything gets thrown out the window. It's like,
one of the things he said, this is a good point, is that he said he strung along the detectives. He said the best lies are the ones that are mostly true. So if you think about that in all of this, the best lies are mostly true. So he would tell a little bit of a truth, right? And then just be deceptive as all hell after that. And then people didn't know what was going on.
And is there an increased percentage of abuse in children who are adopted and are not the biological children of the adopted parents?
Unfortunately, we see abuse like that across the board. Yeah, across the board, it doesn't seem
There's
to
no
matter.
higher level for kids who are adopted. I'm just trying to provide clarity.
Yeah, I don't know that, but in this case, like I said, with the things he said about you don't do these things to family, yet he did them, I think in this case we can certainly point to it.
Yeah, and I mean, he was clearly just a sick individual, and he would have found an excuse no matter what.
He would have found an excuse. He would have found a way to justify. What we can tell is he was incredibly manipulative of his wife. He was controlling of Aundria, of other people in their lives. I mean, I know we'll get to it later, but he tried to be controlling of the investigation, of what he told law enforcement. And you know what? There were times he tried to control me as the prosecutor, too. I can tell you, though, that didn't go over very well.
Yeah. What did he do to try to control you?
He would only give certain snippets of things and would say that, they're never going to find her, they're never going to find out. So he was trying to control whether or not we were able to charge him. And so before he told us where Aundria was buried in the backyard, I had already done a lot of research. I mean, a lot of research looking at other cases in Michigan that were able to be charged even though the body wasn't found. So what Mr. Bowman, and I'm not even going to give him that credibility, what the murderer didn't know is he was going to be charged one way or the other.
He had no idea who he was up against.
I don't think he did, and I think he underestimated me from the beginning to the end.
Because you're a woman, or just he underestimated everybody because he's gotten away with it for so long. Like, he's smarter than everyone.
I think he underestimated everybody. But the fact that this is a man who was manipulative, who controlled all the women, I mean, all of them in his life up to this point. And on the Michigan case for Aundria, he got a female head prosecutor and a female judge. And I don't think he liked either one of us very much.
Yeah. I mean, you guys put him in his place.
Yeah.
So
we're rightfully where he belongs,
yes,
to be honest
exactly,
with you.
100%. I want to jump back to Aundria. Why did she recant her abuse claim, and what was the abuse claim?
So she had reported that he had been sexually abusing her for a period of time. She told some friends.
How old was she?
I think she was 13.
When she went to the police with this?
She went to some friends at school and kind of hid out at one of the friends' houses for a couple days until the mom found her and said, "Hey, sweetheart, you got to go to school. You need to go to school and tell someone at school what's happening." So she did, and they reported to the Department of Health and Human Services. Really, all we know is, Child Protective Services. That's what everybody seems to know as the phrase. And there was an investigation that got started. But the minute Aundria told her adopted mom, she didn't believe her. Aundria had no support in that household. Bowman was denying he did it. The mom said, "You're lying. You just want attention." And, the authorities get involved. Now, back then, they didn't really know a lot of the things we know now. They didn't know how recantation could happen or pressure on a child might make them feel responsible for all of this. Nobody knew that. We didn't have CACs back then. And so when I think you look at that, Aundria felt alone. They even took her to the pastor at their church so they could have family therapy to talk about all of this. And that is absolutely something we wouldn't do at this point in time, currently, right? You wouldn't put a victim on the spot like that.
And in that case, it's probably everybody just doubling down on how she's wrong or misunderstanding some type of interaction that happened between her and her adopted father. Like you don't understand, or you don't get it, or the mom saying you're lying and you just want attention. And obviously, I mean, what does that do to an abuse victim?
Well, a child should be able to look to their parents as the people who protect them and support them no matter what, right? And so even if the mom thought she was lying, she should have gotten Aundria some help to say, "Hey, what precipitated her to come forward and say these bad things? Let's figure this out." She didn't do that. She just said she's a liar, and she pushed her away. And we know from friends of Aundria that Aundria was afraid if she was taken out of the home by the authorities that maybe he'd start eventually on the little sister. And Aundria thought she had to protect that baby sister. She spent a lot of time with her, and she felt responsible for her even though she was only 13, 14 years old.
I mean, that's just an overwhelming amount of pressure to put on. Still a child.
Right.
Still a child. I can't even.
Adults can't take that pressure sometimes. Yeah. And we're looking at this poor kid who had nobody in the world to turn to. And, Bowman was convincing. I mean, he, had done a lot of things bad up to this point. He'd murdered somebody, he'd raped several people, and he got away with it. And so he knew how to spin his story to make people believe him.
Did he ever abuse the younger daughter?
Not that we know of.
Okay.
But again, remember, she was family.
She was, yeah. I mean, but again, he's also a liar. So that whole line about the family,
right?
What does it really mean from someone like Bowman?
It may not mean anything, you have to try to find out what you believe he says when he says it and what fits with the evidence. But that piece of it kind of fits. She's family. She was never physically abused. She was never any of those things that Aundria was.
Yeah. How did his ongoing lies and the community's trust in him shape the investigation and ultimately delay justice?
You know, when he reported Aundria missing and she was initially charged with larceny, you know, police were looking at the investigation as a runaway, right? And every year after her disappearance, law enforcement would pull out the case, see if there was any sightings of Aundria. They actually worked with the Secret Service to do something called a signs of life check. And so they ran her birth date, they ran her social, they ran all kinds of things to see if, hey, maybe she's a runaway and she's living in another state. Let's find her. Nothing ever came up. Well, we know the reason for that. She was already dead, right? But law enforcement tried to turn over every stone they could to keep the investigation moving. And they would go back again and again and again to talk to Bowman and his wife. Is there anything else you can think of? Is there anything new you can help us with? You know, at one point investigators were trying to develop a DNA profile so that if missing persons were located and maybe their bodies were located, they would be able to do DNA analysis to say this is Aundria or this isn't. But the items that they gave law enforcement didn't have enough DNA, like her hairbrush, her toothbrush, her flute. She played the flute in the band. And so unfortunately, those items didn't yield enough to look forward to say, hey, is there DNA on these things?
Is there anything else about the history of Aundria, Kathleen, or the murderer that you think people should be aware of or know or keep in mind?
You know, one of the things he claimed, and this was confirmed by his wife, is that he was at one point diagnosed with intermittent explosive disorder.
Which is?
A psychological circumstance where if someone explodes, they kind of lose control. They don't know what they're doing. But the way that he spun it was an excuse, right? And so, you know, he used that excuse in the kidnapping of the young girl that he ultimately got convicted for and went to prison. You know, his wife was around for that. Aundria was about 5 when that happened. And the wife waited for him to get out of prison. And then they moved to Allegan County, where ultimately Aundria was murdered about 9 years later. But when Bowman finally was going to tell his wife really what he did and where Aundria was buried for 30 years, which, by the way, was in their backyard, in their own backyard, he buried her. The first thing the wife said was, you know, not, oh my God, I can't believe you did this. I can't believe you lied to me. I hate you. None of that. It was, oh, was it the intermittent explosive disorder again? I mean, really? That's where you're going to go? He just told you he killed your child, and that's the route you want to take.
Is that because she was so shocked? Is that because it makes her look bad, or like she could be an accomplice, or that she's a bad wife, bad mother? Is that just what type of, is that a common reaction?
I don't think it's a common reaction. I wouldn't like to think that would be my reaction if I was, well, if someone told me they had done that.
Yeah.
But we never found any evidence that she knew about these things. But what I think he really did is he manipulated his wife, up one side, down another, and
He manipulated everyone.
But he made his wife believe that, gosh, I'm not a bad guy. I'm a great guy. I just have this disorder that makes me lose control, so it's not my fault.
Yep.
And for whatever reason, she believed it.
We want to add in questions for the audience. We want to add in questions for the audience at the end of every episode from here on out that will either be answered in that last episode that we talked about, and probably more realistically will be answered on our social media pages, just so we can have constant engagement with you all. So our question for today is, what do you think can be done to prevent the silence or recantation of abuse victims, especially in cases with little support systems in place? If you have any additional questions, we'd love to hear from you. Please send us a message on our Instagram page. It's BTV, Behind the Verdict _pod.
And if you'd like more information and those behind the scenes insights we've started talking about and have a lot more to do, please look at us at Behind the Verdict.
You can find us wherever you listen to your podcasts. Thank you for listening.
Thank you.